Any of you shop at Target?
Hello?
Hello, Leoni.
Hi.
Welcome. I've just introduced you, and we are interested and anxious to hear what you have to share with us. And we can hear you just fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There's a pretty bad echo on my side, so I'm going to try to go ahead without bumping into my own voice. Do you hear the echo?
No, it sounds fine on this end.
Okay. All right, so I have a short PowerPoint, which I hope that can be put online. Here it is. So I started getting involved in this issue about 2 years ago, and I'm going to take you through fairly quickly everything that has taken me 2 years to learn. And I hope that it's informative because it is, the state has done everything they can to obscure their plans, as well as InBloom, and make it very difficult for parents to know what's actually going on. So can I have the first slide, please? Okay. So, InBloom is a nonprofit corporation that the Gates Foundation started with $100 million. Sometimes they mention the Carnegie Corporation as well, but they actually only contributed a very little money. Student data is uploaded onto a cloud operated by Amazon.com, and the data system is designed and developed by the wireless generation, also called Amplify, owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. And all the districts in the state were told to sign up over the summer this fall with one of 3 data dashboards from for-profit vendors that would be populated with data from the InBloom cloud. And in protest of this arrangement, more than 40 districts actually returned their Race to the Top money so that they wouldn't have to sign up for one of these dashboards, but the state insists that their student data will be uploaded onto the InBloom cloud, whether they sign up for dashboards or not. So InBloom plans to commercialize these data and essentially, with state or district consent, offer it up to vendors to help them develop their personalized learning products, which are essentially software that are supposed to be used in schools to help students learn. Next slide, please. So this is a quick timeline. I'm just going to go through it briefly. But originally, back in 2011, the state had a plan to have wireless generation build their internal state data system with a no-bid contract. And after a lot of people protested and groups protested because of the phone hacking scandals in the UK that the News Corp was involved in, the state controller actually canceled that contract. But then a few months later, they went ahead and without even asking the state controller, they signed a contract with the Shared Learning Collaborative with an operating system that would also be built by wireless generation. But because no funds originally changed hands, it didn't have to go through the controller's office. Next slide, please. So what information is being shared? It took us an awful lot of time to get this out of the state education department, and they kept on changing. First they told us nothing, and then they told us nothing, and then they told us something, and then they changed that, and then they changed that again. And so what we had to go through too was what was on the InBloom site, where they're collecting literally thousands of pieces of data, incredibly sensitive personal stuff. But finally, the state published their data dictionary, I think in August, after promising it months before. And what it said was that the state was going to share for all public school students in the states, students' names, addresses, phone numbers, emails, their grades, their test scores, their proficiency levels, their racial and ethnic status, their economic status, including whether they're on free lunch or any sort of public assistance, their disability status, their health condition, including their 504 conditions, which is, if you know, could be anything from allergy to epilepsy, and detailed attendance and suspension records, and whether those suspensions are in-school or out-of-school suspensions. And the information collected on every child will include from the day they enroll in pre-K or kindergarten to the day they graduate, including 12 years worth of data. And I asked Ken Wagner of the State Education Department if there's any limit to the addition that districts can upload, including all the data fields that InBloom wants to collect, which include information such as kids' arrest records, whether they've been pregnant, assorted things that would be absolutely barred from being shared with anyone if they were actually arrested. The criminal justice system would keep these arrest records much more private. And they said no, that there was nothing that they were actually encouraged districts to share more. Also immigration records. So after high school graduation, now the state has said that all this data will be transferred into the state archives for at least 8 years with as yet unclear restrictions on who could access it. Next slide, please. So what about privacy? What InBloom and the State Education Department says, which fooled a lot of people, is that this is totally FERPA compliant. Now, FERPA was a federal law that was originally passed in the 1970s, I think, was extremely strong, and was one of the strongest privacy protection laws that we had. But it's been revised by the U.S. Department of Education twice in recent years to encourage this kind of private personal data sharing with basically anyone that the state or districts want, as long as they can call them authorized agents, contractors, or for instructional purposes. So basically, if there was someone standing on the street who was selling workbooks, if the state or your district decided that they should have your kid's information because they could provide instructional materials to your kid that would help him, they would be allowed to. And there'd be no restrictions on the data that they could share with that vendor. The Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, was sued recently because a DC advocacy group called EPIC said that their revisions of the regulations conflicted with the original language and intent of the law. But unfortunately, that case was thrown out of court, not on substantive grounds, but because the plaintiffs lacked standing, according to the judge. And there's an important point to be made, which is we now have fairly strong laws and regulations regulating the sharing of healthcare data and also the data gained by companies from kids' online usage at home. And if the exact same data, for example, your child's disabilities or 504 conditions were in your child's medical files, it would be completely illegal to share them with any third parties without parental consent, and the person doing that could go to jail. And there are also strict regulations about how the data can be used for a child who goes online and plays games or whatever, signs up for programs, if they're using it at home. But the exact same medical records, if they're in your child's educational files, or if this exact same program is being used and assigned in school, there are essentially no limits on who it can be shared with. Next slide. So what about security? As I think the host mentioned, there are real problems with putting data on clouds, as we've seen recently with massive breaches in the last few months. Living Social, which was on an Amazon.com cloud, like InBloom, and in fact the company is partly owned by Amazon.com, and then of course the Target breach, which affected up to more than 100 million customers. And in surveys, technology professionals 86% of them say they do not trust clouds to hold their more sensitive data. And in fact, in InBloom's security policy, which used to be online, it clearly said that InBloom would not guarantee the security of the information stored in InBloom, or that it would not be intercepted when transmitted. So that's a sign that even InBloom felt that it could not guarantee the safety of this information. Please, next slide. So here's a sample data dashboard from the InBloom website. I haven't actually seen visual representations of the data dashboards that are being developed by the 3 companies that have signed up with SED, but I know that they have warning flags that go up if your child gets into some sort of trouble, or doesn't come to school, or is suspended, or is having trouble with something or another. But this is the one that was from the InBloom video that looked at kids and measured them according to their character strengths. If you can read it, it says, rates them on whether they show enthusiasm, resist distractions, etc., etc. And of course, there's going to be a lot of test score data and academic data on this as well. Please change. So more and more, I've been trying to investigate the issue and talking to teachers and other parents about the issue of these data dashboards, which many school districts have, but it's not clear how much information is stored on them now and how far back they go in terms of the data that they contain. So I know that it's just this year that this New York State said that they were going to be collecting personally identifiable suspension records. And I think the data dashboards that schools have now do not, in general, contain that information. But what we know from research is that teachers, if they have a lot of negative information about a student, especially before they've even met that student, they tend to make negative stereotypes about those students. And often those stereotypes tend to be self-fulfilling. So as a parent, I was always glad that my child had a new teacher every year. He got a fresh start, whatever trouble he got into last year. He could prove himself again this year. And yet this, the whole point of some of these dashboards is to make all your child's history enter into a permanent record from the age of 4 onwards that is going to be accessible to your child's teacher and others at a touch of a fingertip. And we know that that can have very harmful effects on their preconceptions of your child and, in fact, their future success. So there's one research project that was done in the opposite direction where they took classes of kids and they randomly told their teacher that certain kids had been tested and found to be predicted to make big jumps in IQ this year. And of course the kids, as I said, were randomly chosen, but at the end of the year, the kids who actually made the jumps in IQs were the ones that their teachers had been told would make those jumps. Because of course the teachers paid more attention to them, gave them more positive reinforcement. And that's exactly the same thing that can happen with negative information. Next slide. So when I first started getting involved in this, and InBloom was planning to collect the information of 9 partner states. And this is what it said on its website. And then they said more states and districts will be joining soon. And if you know the power and wealth of the Gates Foundation, you know that that wasn't simply an idle threat, because they have millions of dollars in incentives to lure more states and districts into their various programs. And so just as I was alarmed about New York State, I was also alarmed about these other states and wondered if the parents in these other states knew. So I started blogging about this, and Diane Ravitch started blogging about it, and I finally got national reporter Stephanie Simon of Reuters, now of Politico, to write about it. And the news spread very fast, and sure enough, not only had no parent been told in the 8 other states, but in many cases the state school boards had not been told. The district school boards that were participating had not been told. I mean, the same was in New York. When I started writing about it, I heard from elected school board members and superintendents throughout the state who knew nothing about it. But everywhere but New York, parents managed to fight back successfully. And in a matter of only a few months, every single other InBloom state pulled out completely or put their data sharing plans on indefinite hold. In April, the Louisiana superintendent pulled out of the program. In May, the Georgia superintendent pulled out of the program. In August, the only participating district in North Carolina pulled out of the program. In November, in Jefferson County, Colorado, the second largest district in Colorado, and the only one that was participating as a pilot district, their school board actually turned over, partly because of this issue. And their superintendent was forced to resign, and they pulled out of the program. And then the advocates actually forced the state superintendent to completely sever its ties and say that no district could participate even if they wanted to. And then finally, I was invited to Illinois and to Chicago to do some briefings of editorial boards, the major papers there, and also to do a forum for parents. And that night, even before I given the forum, the state announced that it would be made completely voluntary on the part of the districts. A few days later, Chicago pulled out. And though InBloom refuses to tell us, we believe that only one district is participating, and they're not going to actually upload data to InBloom. They're going to use local servers. The next slide. So what's happened here in New York? There were several different bills that were introduced in both the state and the assembly last year to block InBloom. 2 of them passed the assembly at the end of the session almost unanimously, and that's A6059A and A7872, though no bill passed the Senate, and it was blocked by the Senate leadership. And then, but there are 2 bills that were resubmitted, one by Senator Robach with bipartisan support, which is the best bill, we think, which would bar redisclosures of data without parental consent, as InBloom is designed to do, and would strengthen security for all disclosures through high-level encryption, audits, parental notification, indemnification for breaches, and also would restrict the kind of data sharing the state agencies are now planning to do as part of the P20 system. And then there's another bill that was introduced by Senator Flanagan, which would allow districts to opt out, but not parents to opt out. And the one thing it would do, it would allow the commissioner to appoint a privacy officer. But that person would, again, be appointed by the commissioner, and we don't have a lot of faith in this commissioner that privacy officer would do anything. In fact, there's a law that was passed in 1984 that requires every state agency to have a privacy officer. And Ken Wagner seems to be acting in that position, though he is not officially named as such. And that bill, Flanagan's bill, has passed through the Education Committee. Next slide. So more recently, because of the protests from leaders of both parties, the regions had a task force would call for a delay in the state sharing data with InBloom until privacy concerns could be addressed. It's not clear what that means or until when that would be. Just about a week ago, the Assembly passed an omnibus bill which would bar the state education department from providing any student data to third parties for the purpose of the data dashboards until at least July 1st, 2015, and would allow parents to opt out of any data being shared with vendors in the future. And then just 3 days ago, the Governor's Commission said they wanted the state to ditch the contract with InBloom, calling it a distraction, but not to allow parents to opt out or consent of data sharing. and said that the state should find alternative paths to accomplish the goals of data transparency and analytics, which essentially means allow data mining to go on without parental opt-out or consent by a different route than InBloom. I think what the corporate reformers have finally realized that InBloom is a real bad brand, it's a real toxic brand, and the sooner they ditch that, the better, and get on with other ways to do the same sort of thing. But we still haven't gotten out of the contract, and Commissioner King has said nothing about getting rid of the contract. All he said is that he is going to start uploading data to InBloom in July with the launch of the data dashboards in September. And then, by the way, in this January, districts have to pay for the data dashboards, and the state has to start paying for InBloom. And what the point of doing all this when it looks like the districts won't want to pay for InBloom, and at that point, presumably, can have their data deleted? I have no idea, and I'm not even clear absolutely that the state is going to let them delete the data at that point. Next slide. So even if we manage to slay the beast of InBloom, we realize that there are a lot of other monsters that are popping up in its place. So what parents need to do is find out exactly what your school or district is already doing with your child's personal data, which vendors are they sharing with it, for what purposes, and what are the security provisions. And if possible, take a look at the contract. Now I realize that this slide also has information about New York City, so skip over that. But there are programs such as code.org that, go back for a second because I think the last bullet points are relevant, which ask for personal student data for 7 years. Watch out for any freemium program that your school or district is signed up for, because they're getting something valuable in exchange, and it's probably your kid's personal data. And with the growth of online learning and the Common Core standards and online testing, all this data is extraordinarily more valuable to vendors. And the K-12 education market is a $500 billion market that vendors are very eager to get their hands on and to start data mining. Next slide. So as I made that point, with uniform test score data, uniform proficiency levels, and online learning, all these companies want to get a hold of your child's data and market their products directly to your children. The U.S. Department of Education has required that all states have cradle-to-the-grave internal data systems where all state agencies, including the health department and the criminal justice system and the education department and various other agencies, will share the data about your child and track them through life, and may be able to share them with researchers and other groups without your knowledge or consent. And the PARC testing consortium that the New York State is going to start field testing this spring and perhaps start using the year after also has very lax privacy protections and is going to be collecting a tremendous data about your child and potentially sharing it with vendors and researchers without your knowledge or consent. And is there one more slide, or is that it? Oh yeah, so how can you help? This is the most important thing. Contact your senators, ask them to support the Robach bill, 5932. It has bipartisan support, but it's not yet moving through the Senate. Some Long Island parents started a petition. I had one about a year ago, and this is a new one that's on moveon.org that goes to the state legislators and the governor. You can sign up for news updates about privacy at my website, classizematters.org. And of course, if you can, opt your child out of the test, because without test scores, all this data becomes much less useful and valuable to InBloom or data mining vendors. So that's about it, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So any
Keep
questions?
those websites up on the screen.
Yeah.
Good, back and down.
So any questions?
No, the one that was just up before
The
this.
last slide.
Had the,
There it is.
there you go. Oh, where'd it go?
There it is.
No. I want, oh, the anti-InBloom petition, yeah, that's what I want.
All of this is in the intake website. So the petition is already under actions. Go to the intake website as often as you can, because anything that comes, I'm posting it there, under actions, anywhere that is easy to reach. I'm posting the link in Facebook, but all of these things are there or will be there, and this part will be there, and Monty's will be there too.
Hi, so my children are in kindergarten, so they're not taking the standardized test yet. But my question is, obviously they're collecting their data already. I know that the school district sent home something asking to allow a HIPAA release to allow the school to contact their pediatricians, and I put a big X through that. I said, absolutely not. What can we, obviously we can't opt out of this stuff or refuse this stuff, but what can we as parents do to prevent them from getting any more data than they already are collecting on our children?
I would talk to your school board about it, talk to your principal, talk to other parents, make sure that they're not already sharing that data with other vendors, that they should not be, and advocate for your district to pull out of the data dashboards as quickly as possible. Assuming that the InBloom project does not get stopped. But as I said, this is a growing problem. It's not going to go away even with InBloom, and every parent has to be extremely vigilant at a local level with their school board and with their school, asking them exactly how this data is being used and exactly with whom it is being shared. And hopefully school board members and superintendents will be more responsive to parents than the state education department, which has proven itself to be incredibly impervious to the concerns of parents. What we found to our surprise, which is really great, is that the vast majority of school board members and superintendents across the state have come out vocally against InBloom. In fact, there was a survey which showed that 80% of school board members opposed InBloom and also agreed that parents should have the right to opt out. So they are sensitive to this issue already, and I think it's up to parents to pursue this issue wherever it goes. And the first step is finding out exactly how this data is being used and who is being shared with. See if you can see the contract and pursue it from there. And the park thing is another, huge threat over our heads. We're going to have to try to get that park contract out of state ed to see exactly how they plan to share the data if they do go into park. But it's yet another reason why the Common Core, I think, is so dangerous, even beyond the fact that it's developmentally inappropriate, it's too rigid, the curriculums are terrible, the tests are terrible. It is also another vehicle to create a national database of student data and that could track your kid through life.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Leoni. Thank you for your work. Oh, is there a question? I'm sorry. Excuse me. We have one more.
Hi, my name is Mark Beetham. My wife and I have 2 daughters in the local school district, one in middle school and one in high school. The question I have refers to the slide you had up there about March 10th, the recent commissioner's report, the commission's report from the governor having to do with, they asked they're going to distance themselves from InBloom, it's a distraction, and as you say, there's no indication that the state has learned anything about it, they're just potentially severing their ties from InBloom. But what I'm trying to figure out is what's in it for the state. From your perspective, why would they persist given all this backlash, given all this attention? Is there some sense in which they're going to benefit economically, or there's, I don't know, Commissioner King could move from that to working with one of these agencies or something? Why do they seem to be digging their heels in? What's their advantage in this?
So, I would be speculating because I don't have inside knowledge. I find it astonishing how stubborn Commissioner King has been when every other state has actually bowed to much less pressure than exists here in New York State. But I do know that the Gates Foundation in recent years has given more than $15 million to the state education department. The person running the InBloom project is a Regents Fellow whose salary is paid largely by the Gates Foundation. And the Gates Foundation, until recently anyway, must have been absolutely desperate to keep this project going one way or another, and perhaps still sees New York State as its only saving grace. So I imagine as more and more other states pulled out, the pressure from the Gates Foundation on John King probably got greater and greater. But we foiled all the communications through a Freedom of Information Act between John King and Merrill Tisch and the Gates Foundation and InBloom and News Corp. And they basically refused to respond to our FOIL. So they first came back after a few months and said, we'll tell you in a year whether we'll give you anything at all. And then we went back and we restricted our request, and then they said, we'll give you stuff up to a year from now. And this contrasts hugely from similar FOILs that were done in Louisiana and Illinois, where they got all the emails very quickly. And from those other emails, particularly in Louisiana, we got a sense of how they lured people into this project. So there was this Regents Fellow who's paid by Gates Foundation and working inside the state education department actually knew John White from his days at DOE and was pulling John White into the project. And the Gates Foundation has a million different projects going with these states on charter co-locations and teacher evaluations, and they fly them to these, junkets where they present all this stuff to them, and then they say, oh, and then there's this InBloom thing too, and you really have to listen to this, and you really have to participate in this, and they pull them into one project and another with the lure of more funding. And especially more funding, I think, for the bureaucracy and the people that are going to man the staff at the state education departments. So they can be very enticing. But I still have no particular explanation of why New York State has been so much worse than any other state in the country when it comes to student privacy and InBloom.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Leoni, for all the work you've done and the time you've spent with us. One of the ways that InBloom has moved the way it has is it's been a stealth project. As you said, a lot of people don't know about it, and you now have helped us to know a bit more about it, and hopefully we can join your efforts to stop it. So thank you.